The apartment is dark, save for the faint glow of the laptop screen casting eerie shadows across the room. Ethan's fingers hover over the keyboard, every part of him screaming to stop, yet he can't pull away. The clock ticks in the background, each second more oppressive than the last. His heart pounds with a rhythm of dread and his mind spirals into a sea of doubt. He clicks. The video file opens, and his breath catches in his throat. Ethan leans forward, his eyes narrowing as the video plays. The camera, hidden in plain sight, captures every detail of their apartment. The couch where they once sat together, the kitchen where they made meals, the bedroom where he held her. As the footage continues, it becomes clear. His suspicion wasn't just paranoia. There she is, Claire, his Claire, laughing with another man. The sight is sickeningly familiar, but also foreign. He freezes. A pit forms in his stomach as he watches. Her smile at him in that way, the way she used to smile at him. Ethan's breath hitches as the man's hand slides over Claire's back. The camera captures their closeness, the kind of intimacy Ethan thought was reserved only for them. Claire leans in, her lips brushing against his. Ethan's heart lurches. His world tilts off its axis, and for a moment time seems to stop. No, Ethan whispers, his voice barely audible as the man's lips press harder against Claire's. The shock hits like a violent wave, crashing over him, drowning him. He can't tear his eyes away. The anger, the betrayal, it surges within him, too fast, too furious to control. Ethan slams his fist onto the desk, the force of it rattling the table. His hands tremble as he rewinds the footage, again and again. The images blur as his mind scrambles to comprehend the impossible truth. Claire, his Claire, is with another man, in his home, in their shared space. The warmth he thought was once sacred, now tarnished by lies. His breath is shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. The pain in his chest shifts, sharp, almost unbearable, replaced by something darker, something consuming. The hollow ache fills with a swelling tide of fury. Ethan had never been the kind of person to feel at home. His childhood had been a string of empty rooms, cold silences, and the constant hum of his mother's disappointment. His father had left when he was too young to understand why, and his mother, though physically present, was emotionally absent. He never quite learned how to trust, how to open up. As an adult, that fear of abandonment still lingered, haunting him like an old ghost. Every time someone got too close, a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. With Claire, it was no different. Despite his love for her, there was always the nagging thought at the back of his mind. What if she leaves me too? Claire was different. She had always been the one who was noticed, the one who had ambition coursing through her veins. She thrived on the energy of others, the praise, the attention. But underneath it all, something was missing. She had built her life on the foundation of external approval, work achievements, friendships, and outward success, but none of it satisfied the hunger within her. She wanted more. She wanted passion, excitement, validation she couldn't find at home with Ethan. He was stable, dependable, but he didn't spark the fire inside her anymore. At night, when the house grew silent and their routine became suffocating, Claire found herself yearning for something else, something that would make her feel alive again. Outwardly, Ethan and Claire appeared perfect. Their apartment, their lives, it all seemed so ideal. But underneath the polished exterior was a fragile foundation, cracking from the pressure of unspoken frustrations. Ethan loved her with a depth that sometimes felt suffocating. Every glance, every word, every moment was weighed down by the fear of losing her. He clung to her, afraid that if he let go for even a second, she would slip away. Claire, on the other hand, felt stifled. Ethan's constant need for reassurance, his silent demands for affection. It made her restless. She loved him, but there were moments when the predictability of their relationship felt like a cage. She longed for the freedom to be herself, to experience life outside the boundaries of their world. But she never dared to say it. It started subtly. Late-night work events, time spent with friends that stretched later than usual. Claire began, pulling away, her warmth becoming a distant memory. Ethan noticed the small changes first, the way she'd glance at her phone with a flicker of something he couldn't place. The subtle way she'd slip into a conversation with someone else when they were together. His mind raced. Is she hiding something? Why is she pulling away? At first, he tried to dismiss it, but then came the little things, her absence from dinner, her distracted gaze, the tight-lipped smiles. The doubt started creeping in. He found himself staring at her, wondering if he was missing something. Was she slipping through his fingers? Was she slipping into someone else's arms? The thought of it gnawed at him, leaving him with a sick feeling in his stomach that only grew worse. Unable to speak his fears aloud, Ethan's paranoia began to fester in silence. He couldn't ask her outright. That would expose his vulnerabilities, his insecurities. So he devised another plan. He began to install hidden cameras in their shared spaces. The justification was simple. I just need to know the truth. He worked quietly, his hands trembling as he set the cameras in place. Just a little confirmation, he thought. Then I'll be able to breathe again. But as he stepped back, looking at his work, a wave of guilt washed over him. Was he really this desperate? Was this the only way to keep control of something that was slipping from his grasp? He tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered like a dark shadow. The camera blinked to life in the corner of the living room. Ethan stared at it, his chest tight. He couldn't help but feel the weight of his actions. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about crossing a line that shouldn't have been crossed. He looked at Claire's face, sleeping peacefully beside him, unaware of the trap he'd set. Is this who I've become? The question haunted him as the days passed, each camera recording moments he was never meant to see. Each time he checked the footage, he felt a sense of violation, like an intruder in his own life. Yet, with every clip he watched, his paranoia grew stronger. The silence was deafening, but the truth remained hidden. Until now. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Claire had already begun creating a life of her own. In the late hours, she found herself in the arms of others, men who made her feel seen, desired, and appreciated in ways Ethan no longer could. The attention, the thrill, it was intoxicating. She told herself it was harmless, just something to make her feel alive again. After all, what did it matter? Ethan wouldn't even notice. Or would he? Each encounter only deepened the cracks in their relationship, though Claire refused to admit it to herself. She told herself that it was just a phase, a momentary lapse. But the more she sought out that forbidden excitement, the further she drifted from Ethan, and the further she fell into her own lies. Ethan's world had narrowed to a single obsession: the videos. His laptop was an extension of his hand, flicking between clips of Claire's every move. He replayed the same footage over and over, each time looking for something he hadn't noticed before. The sound of her laughter, her smiles, once cherished, now felt like cruel reminders of the betrayal, festering beneath the surface. Every time he pressed play, his heartbeat quickened. He couldn't escape it. Was that a glance? A touch that wasn't there before? The questions swirled in his mind, and with each answer he found, he only needed more. Claire was no longer just his wife. She was an enigma, a puzzle that demanded solving no matter the cost. He stared at the screen, eyes bloodshot as hours melted away. Was she lying all this time? The footage felt like fresh wounds, each frame deeper than the last. Ethan's hands trembled as he watched Claire and Jake together, laughing, touching, entwining themselves in a way that he never had with her. The pain was unbearable. Each smile she gave him in the clips felt like a dagger to the heart. His heart wrenched with every scene, every moment that revealed her secret world. One he had never known existed. The whirlwind of emotions was suffocating. Despair settled in his chest, thick and heavy, and anger simmered just below the surface. How could she do this to me? He had loved her with everything he had, and now all of it felt like a lie. His chest tightened as fury replaced grief, and thoughts of revenge started to blossom in his mind. He wasn't just hurt. He was ready to make her pay. Flashbacks of Claire's life before the affair loomed in her mind like a shadow. The loneliness had always been there, silent but ever present. She tried to fill the void with the comfort of routine, the security of Ethan's love, but it never quite felt like enough. He loved her, yes. But there was always something missing. The passion, the excitement. Jake had been an escape. He didn't make her feel safe, he made her feel alive. When he touched her, she felt seen, wanted. When she looked into his eyes, there was a fire that made her feel desirable again. She wasn't just Ethan's wife. She was someone new with him, someone powerful, someone important. With Jake, she wasn't invisible. She was everything. Jake had always been charming. At first, Claire thought it was harmless. He made her laugh, reminded her that there was more to life than the monotony of her marriage. But as time went on, his charm began to take on a darker edge. He had a way of pulling her in, subtly, slowly, making her feel like she was the one in control. But in truth, Jake wasn't offering freedom. He was binding her to him with invisible chains. He knew her weaknesses, the cracks in her foundation, and he exploited them. Every word, every gesture, crafted to make her need him more, to make her feel like she couldn't live without him. The attention he gave her wasn't genuine, it was calculated. She was just another piece of his puzzle, a conquest to add to his list. Claire didn't see it. Not yet. But soon she would. Ethan couldn't sit idly by any longer. The quiet ache in his chest had turned to restlessness, a need to confront the truth, even if it meant exposing the fractures in their relationship. He began testing the waters, dropping subtle hints in conversations, hoping for some sign that would confirm his suspicions without him having to ask directly. "Going out again tonight?" he asked casually one evening, his voice light but carrying an undercurrent of tension. Claire didn't even flinch. "Yeah, just grabbing dinner with some friends," she said, brushing past him as she reached for her coat. He studied her face, looking for a crack in the facade, something that would betray her, but there was nothing. Only the usual smile, the same routine. Does she really think I can't see it? He didn't speak, but the question lingered in the air. His mind raced. He couldn't keep up this charade forever. He needed answers. Claire felt it, though she didn't understand why. Ethan's behavior had shifted. At first it was subtle, his questions more pointed, his comments tinged with something that felt like accusation. He wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding. But the weight of his gaze, the quiet probing, it unsettled her. "I'll be home late tonight," she had said the night before. But Ethan didn't respond with his usual, "Be safe," or "Don't stay out too late." Instead, he had merely nodded, his eyes lingering a second too long. It wasn't just the questions, it was the look in his eyes. That shadow of suspicion that Claire couldn't quite shake. She tried to shrug it off. Maybe. I'm just imagining things. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Ethan was no longer the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who trusted her implicitly. It was as if the weight of his doubts hung in the air, suffocating her. Ethan had reached a breaking point. His thoughts were consumed with one singular goal: exposing her. He had the evidence, her lies, her betrayal, everything. But what good would it do? What would he gain by confronting her in the heat of anger? A part of him wanted to scream, to lash out, to make her feel the same pain he'd been drowning in. But another part of him, the part that had always loved her, hesitated. What if I'm wrong? The question haunted him, but the fire of rage quickly burned it away. He wanted justice. He wanted her to know what she'd done to him. He wanted her to understand that betrayal, once it seeped in, could never be undone. He needed to be smart, precise. He couldn't let emotion cloud his judgment. The cameras were no longer just a tool for confirmation. They had become a crutch, a way for Ethan to convince himself that what he was doing was justified. I'm not spying. I'm just protecting myself, he would tell himself. But deep down, he knew the truth. The line between justice and obsession had blurred, and now he wasn't sure which side he was on. Every new clip, every new piece of information only fed his fury. He wasn't just watching Claire anymore. He was controlling the narrative. In his mind, this wasn't just about the affair. It was about power, control, and revenge. And it was too late to stop now. Ethan's anger had taken root, growing darker and more twisted by the day. The plan had formed in his mind. A slow burn, a calculated exposure of Claire's betrayal. He would use her secrets against her, make her face the consequences of her actions. No more questions, no more doubts. It was time to make her pay. Every step was carefully planned, every word he would say perfectly rehearsed. He could already picture the look on her face when the truth came crashing down. The guilt, the shame, the realization that Ethan had seen it all. There would be no escaping it. And when he was done, she would understand that betrayal had a price. Ethan had spent the entire afternoon preparing the meal. His hands were steady, though his mind raced with anticipation. The apartment was dimly lit, the soft glow from the candles flickering like a false sense of warmth. The air was thick with tension, though Claire remained unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. He had told her he wanted to make things special, a quiet evening to reconnect. He smiled to himself, though there was no joy in it. The plate of perfectly cooked steak sat in front of him, untouched, waiting. This was no romantic gesture. It was a trap, and Claire had no idea. As Claire entered the room, her eyes caught the candles and the elaborate setup. She raised an eyebrow, unsure, but smiled nonetheless. "What's all this?" she asked, walking over to the table. Ethan's eyes flickered toward the TV, where the footage of her secret life was already queued up. "Just thought we needed some time together," he said, his voice tight. "You look beautiful tonight." She didn't sense it yet, but soon she would. The table between them felt miles apart despite the closeness. Ethan's hands gripped the sides of his chair as his heart pounded in his chest. Claire, lost in the comfortable illusion of the evening, didn't notice his growing unease. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, Ethan stood up abruptly, his movements sharp. He clicked the remote, and suddenly the screen on the TV flickered to life. Claire's eyes followed his hand, curiosity creeping in, but she froze when she saw the footage. Her breath caught in her throat. "I've been watching," Ethan said quietly, as the video of her and Jake, their faces filled with desire, played on the screen. "Every night, every moment. I know everything." Claire's face drained of color as her hand trembled, but she didn't speak. Her gaze locked on the screen, unable to deny the truth any longer. Ethan's voice dropped lower, harder. "Is that who you've been sneaking around with? Jake?" The silence between them was deafening, filled with the harsh reality of what Ethan had discovered. Claire's heart raced as shame flooded her system, but she couldn't speak. The weight of the truth had her paralyzed, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and shame. It didn't take long for Claire to snap. "How could you do this?" she shouted, the words bursting from her like a dam breaking. "This is an invasion of privacy, Ethan. You had no right to spy. On me." Her voice shook, but anger took over the initial shock. Ethan's eyes burned with cold fury. "You think I violated your privacy?" He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "What about you, Claire? You think it's okay to sneak around with him behind my back?" Her jaw clenched. "I wasn't hurting you. I wasn't hurting anyone," she cried, her voice growing frantic. "You've become a stranger to me, Ethan. You don't see me anymore. You don't see me." Ethan's expression darkened, his fists clenching. "I saw everything," he spat. "I saw how you look at him, how you touch him. You don't get to blame this on me, Claire. You did this. You betrayed me." Claire's tears blurred her vision, but she refused to break. "You think it's that simple? That I'm just some monster? You've been so absorbed in your own insecurities, Enough," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "I've had enough of your lies, of your excuses." Claire sank back into her chair, trembling, her walls crumbling. Her defense faltered, her guilt too much to bear. She looked up at Ethan, the rawness of her emotions spilling over. "I never meant for it to happen," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "But I felt so alone. You don't understand. You never did. I tried, Ethan. I really tried. But everything changed when Jake, he saw me. He saw me like I was someone worth loving again." Ethan's heart twisted in agony at her words, his pain only deepening. "Is that what this was? An affair because you felt seen? Is that what I've been to you all this time? Invisible?" His voice cracked, but he didn't look away from her. Claire's breath hitched, and the tears came harder. "I didn't want to hurt you, I swear. But I couldn't keep pretending anymore. You don't know what it's like, Ethan. You just stopped looking at me. You stopped caring." Ethan's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He had to focus. "So you turned to Jake, and now I'm supposed to believe you can fix this? That it's all just going to go away?" I'm sorry," Claire sobbed, her hands shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to fix it. I was so empty. Please, Ethan, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Just as the tension seemed to have reached its peak, the doorbell rang, cutting through the raw silence. Neither of them moved at first, the shock of the confrontation too overwhelming. But the bell rang again, persistent. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the door. Don't let him in," he warned through gritted teeth, his voice cold, with disdain. Claire's face paled and she hesitated before standing up. I need to speak with him," Claire muttered, walking toward the door. Ethan's gaze followed her, dark and full of suspicion. He knew what was coming. When Claire opened the door, Jake stood there smiling casually, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside. He stepped forward, his eyes shifting between Claire and Ethan. "Everything okay?" Jake asked, glancing at the tension in the room. Claire hesitated, but before she could speak, Ethan's voice cut through. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jake blinked, momentarily confused. "What's going on, man?" The air thickened with hostility as Ethan's fury flared. "What do you think, Jake? You think you can just waltz in here and continue this little game?" Words escalated into a shouting match as Ethan stormed toward Jake, his anger palpable in every word. "You think you can just take what's mine? You think I didn't notice? You used her, Jake. You preyed on her weakness." Jake stood his ground, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "You're a little late to the party, buddy," he retorted, his voice laced with mockery. "She chose me." Claire stepped between them, trying to push Jake back. "This is ridiculous. I never wanted this to happen." Ethan's rage exploded, pushing Claire aside. He grabbed Jake by the collar, pulling him forward, fists clenched. "You don't get to walk out of this, not after what you did." The violence in Ethan's actions shook Claire to her core, but she barely had time to react before Jake shoved Ethan off him, knocking over a lamp in the process. The collision sent the room into chaos as Ethan and Jake squared off. The argument spiraled beyond control, the room filling with harsh words, the sound of fists hitting flesh, and furniture crashing to the ground. It was as though the world had stopped, leaving only the fury of betrayal and the heat of their emotions. Suddenly, in the midst of the chaos, Jake stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the coffee table with his head. The force of the impact was jarring and the room went quiet in an instant. Blood pooled on the floor beneath him, and Claire screamed in horror, rushing to his side. Ethan stood frozen, his chest heaving, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The betrayal, the confrontation, none of it had prepared him for this. The anger had gone too far, and now it had consequences far worse than he could have ever imagined. Jake, no!" Claire cried, panic and disbelief in her voice. Ethan's stomach churned as he looked down at the scene unfolding before him, the magnitude of his actions hitting him with brutal clarity. The room was filled with chaos, and as the consequences of that moment spread, they would all be forced to face the cost of their decisions. The sound of sirens wailed through the night, a chilling reminder that everything had spiraled out of control. Claire sat on the floor beside Jake, her hands trembling as she pressed a towel to his head, blood soaking through. The weight of what had just occurred pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. The door to their apartment had been left ajar, the lights flickering in disarray as if they too had witnessed the chaos. Ethan stood by, his body stiff with guilt, fear, and rage. The confrontation had escalated far beyond what he could have ever imagined. When he heard the approaching sirens, his stomach churned. There was no going back. His eyes flickered between Claire and Jake, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this," Ethan muttered, though the words felt empty. Claire's gaze was vacant, her eyes haunted by the same reality. The police burst through the door moments later, their footsteps heavy as they surveyed the scene. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, knowing that the consequences of his actions were no longer just personal. This was bigger than any betrayal. "Sir," one of the officers called, his voice stern but not unkind. "We need to take a statement." Claire's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't focus on Jake's blood, her own heart pounding in her ears as her hands shook uncontrollably. Guilt clawed at her, suffocating every breath, but it wasn't just the affair that weighed on her. It was the realization of what had been lost in that moment of fury, the moment that had led to Jake's injury and the irreversible damage to her relationship with Ethan. As the officers spoke with Ethan, Claire sat frozen, her thoughts a blur of self-loathing and fear. The fear wasn't just for Jake, it was for herself. Would the police press charges? Would Ethan? Her heart pounded as she replayed the events. Had she gone too far with Jake? Was the affair her fault, or was it Ethan's distance that had driven her into another man's arms? The question gnawed at her. She knew she was guilty of something, but the consequences were too real now. too final. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, who was being questioned at the other side of the room. He avoided her gaze, his silence a testament to his own inner turmoil. The thought of losing him forever, of everything falling apart, settled like a weight on her chest. "I didn't mean for this," she whispered to herself. But the words offered no comfort. The minutes felt like hours as the police took their statements, their voices distant and cold. Ethan stood, his hands pressed against his sides, unable to escape the reality that had come crashing down on him. Jake's condition was still uncertain, and that uncertainty hung over him like a storm cloud. One of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes, looked up at Ethan. "You understand, sir, that you could face assault charges depending on the severity of Mr. Jacobs's injuries?" she asked, her tone more matter-of-fact than sympathetic. Ethan's throat tightened as he nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The thought of jail time, of losing everything he had worked for, suddenly felt very real. He had wanted justice, but this wasn't justice. This was something far darker, something irreversible. "Of course," he managed, his voice hoarse. "I understand." The officer didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on him, almost as if she could see through the facade he had so carefully built. He turned away, struggling to breathe, his mind racing. What had he become? The fallout from that night quickly spread beyond the apartment, touching everyone in their orbit. The phone calls began almost immediately. Family, friends, even distant acquaintances calling, questioning, passing judgment. Ethan's mother was the first to weigh in, her voice shaky but firm on the other end of the line. "You're the one who pushed her away, Ethan," she said, her tone both sympathetic and accusing. "You can't just shut her out and expect her to stay faithful. You've got to take responsibility for your part in this." Ethan's heart clenched at her words. Was she right? Had he been so absorbed in his own feelings of betrayal that he failed to see what was happening to their relationship? But then, he remembered Jake. Remembered the way Claire had let herself fall into someone else's arms. Claire's phone buzzed a few minutes later, a text from her sister. "You're a disgrace." Claire's stomach lurched as she read the words, the weight of her sister's condemnation making her feel smaller than ever. She had never wanted anyone to know, never wanted to face the reality of what she had done. But now it was out in the open and everyone was taking sides. Some friends rallied behind Ethan, condemning Claire's betrayal with harsh words. Others supported Claire, excusing her actions as the product of a broken relationship. But neither of them could escape the judgment. Days passed, but the storm didn't let up. Ethan's mind spiraled deeper into despair as the days wore on. The legal proceedings, the whispers behind his back, and the constant reminder of what he had lost, everything, began to erode him from the inside out. Then came the call from his boss. "Ethan, we've been following the situation closely," his supervisor said, his tone clipped. "We've decided it's best for you to step down. The company cannot risk any further damage to its reputation." The words struck Ethan like a blow to the chest. He didn't respond at first, just stood there, the phone pressed to his ear as the reality of it all settled in. His career, his future, was slipping through his fingers. "Understand?" The voice on the other end pressed. Ethan's response was barely a whisper. "Yeah, I understand." Hanging up, he stared at the walls around him. Every part of his life was falling apart, unraveling thread by thread. The affair, the violence, the loss. It had cost him everything. His job, his dignity, his sense of self. All gone. And for what? A betrayal that had begun with a quiet disconnect had now reduced him to nothing. As the weeks passed, Claire began to reflect on her life with Ethan, her mind racing with the implications of her choices. She had never imagined it would come to this, to an explosive confrontation, to legal consequences, to losing everything. She had always thought there might be a way back, a way to fix the mess she'd made, but now that felt like a distant dream. The guilt still gnawed at her, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of what had happened. Every time she looked at Ethan, she saw a man broken, his spirit shattered by her infidelity. She couldn't live in this environment anymore. The constant tension, the weight of judgment from others, the fear of legal repercussions. It was too much to bear. And so, after much soul-searching, Claire made the decision. She would leave. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the only one left. Standing in front of Ethan, the words barely left her lips, but they were final. "I'm leaving," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I can't do this anymore." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His face was a mixture of resignation and heartbreak, but he didn't stop her. Maybe he knew deep down that this was the end of their love, the end of everything they had once built. As Claire packed her things, she felt a strange sense of liberation, but it was tinged with guilt. She had finally broken free, but the consequences of her actions would stay with her forever. Ethan sat alone in the stark silence of his apartment. The place that once felt like a home now seemed like a tomb. The air felt thick, every corner heavy with memories, and every object, a forgotten coffee mug, a picture frame, only amplified the emptiness. His eyes scanned the room, though they never truly focused on anything. The TV was off, but the light from the window cast a dim glow over the floor, painting the space in muted shades of gray. It felt like he was drowning in the very place he had built around himself. His mind kept circling back to the same moment, the moment when everything changed, when he had confronted Claire with the footage, when everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and loyalty had been shattered beyond repair. That betrayal had broken him, but now, sitting in the silence of his choices, it felt like the true devastation was the isolation that had followed. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He replayed the scene over and over, her defensive words, her angry accusations. He had pushed her to that point. He had pushed so hard, suffocated her with his obsessive need for control. And now the apartment felt as empty as his heart, the weight of what he had done too much to carry alone. Ethan, muttering to himself, "What happened to us? How did it get this bad?" His voice barely broke the silence, but it reverberated inside him like a scream. There was no one left to blame but himself. And deep down, he knew it. As Ethan stared into the empty space, his mind began to unravel the truth he had long tried to suppress. The journey that had led to this moment wasn't just about Claire's affair. It was about his insecurities, his crippling fear of abandonment, and his desperate need to control everything around him. Ethan had never been one to confront his weaknesses. His need for perfection, for control, had shaped every aspect of his life, from his work to his relationship. But in truth, it was all a defense mechanism. His deep-seated insecurities had made him terrified of losing Claire, terrified of facing the loneliness he feared. The more he tried to keep her close, the more he smothered her. Ethan, to himself, voice breaking, "I thought I could control everything, but I couldn't even control her heart." He remembered the countless arguments, the silent treatments, the way he would dig through her phone, his hands shaking as he hunted for signs of disloyalty. The truth was, he had never trusted her. He had never trusted anyone. Not really. His own emotional void had been growing, but instead of filling it with healthy connections, he'd tried to fill it with control. And now, it was all gone. Claire. His job, his dignity. He had wanted control, but now he had nothing left to control but his regret. Across town, Claire sat in the quiet of her new apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. She had been away for days, but she had yet to fully process everything that had happened. She had hoped that time away from Ethan would bring clarity, but all it had done was leave her with an unbearable weight of reflection. She sat on the couch, her eyes staring blankly ahead, her thoughts consumed by the affair, by her decision to leave, and by the realization that her actions were driven by an emptiness she hadn't even understood until now. Claire whispering to herself, "I thought I could fill the void. I thought someone else could fix what was broken inside of me." The affair with Jake had been an escape, a momentary distraction from her own emotional dissatisfaction. She had been searching for something outside herself to fill the void that had been growing in her for years. But now, in the quiet aftermath, Claire realized it wasn't Jake who had been missing. It was her own ability to confront her emotions, to face the parts of herself she had neglected. Her gaze fell to her hands, still trembling slightly from the weight of her actions. Claire took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with the promise of change. She couldn't undo the past, but she could try to rebuild herself from it. The path ahead would not be easy. She had to stop looking for external validation, stop using others as a way to patch up the cracks in her soul. She needed to face herself, to confront the deep fears and insecurities she had buried for so long. Claire, T. And with that she made a vow, a silent commitment to herself. She would rebuild, starting with the foundation of her own self-worth. There would be no more running from the hard truths, no more distractions. She would face what had been missing inside her for so long. The aftermath of betrayal, whether through love, trust, or control, leaves an indelible mark. The story of Ethan and Claire, of their broken relationship, and the aftermath of secrets revealed, is one of profound loss and painful realization. It serves as a stark reminder of the human tendency to manipulate, to control, and to hide from one's own insecurities. It raises critical questions about the blurred lines between justice and revenge, and the devastating consequences of emotional neglect. In the end, neither of them could escape the harsh reality that betrayal was not just an external act. It was born from within, from unspoken fears and desires, and once the damage was done, nothing could ever truly repair it. Ethan sat by his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The footage from the hidden cameras, footage that had once been a symbol of his control, was still stored in his files. It was the last thing he had left, the last piece of evidence that had solidified his belief that Claire had wronged him. But as he stared at the screen, something inside him shifted. The anger, the obsession, it all seemed so trivial now. The truth had already been revealed. He had already destroyed the relationship. What would the footage change now? With a heavy heart, Ethan moved the cursor to the delete button, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he chose to erase the past. Ethan murmuring to himself, "It's over."